the Ghost P-40. On December 8, 1942, exactly 1 year and 1 day after the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, U.S. radar operators stationed in China picked up an unidentified signal that shouldn't have been there. The blip appeared out of nowhere, roughly 200 miles from the American coast, heading straight for friendly airspace. The signature was erratic, slow, and completely unauthorized. Fearing a Japanese surprise attack, 2 P-40 Warhawks were immediately scrambled to intercept the bogey. As the American pilots climbed to altitude and closed the distance, the radio chatter turned from tactical coordination to absolute confusion. They weren't looking at a Japanese Zero. They weren't looking at a bomber. They were looking at a ghost. The plane was an American P-40B Tomahawk, the specific model that had been the primary defense during the attack on Pearl Harbor a year earlier. But its condition was physically impossible. The fuselage was riddled with heavy-caliber bullet holes. The landing gear had been blown away, leaving the wheels dangling uselessly. The fabric on the control surfaces was shredded, and most chillingly, the insignia on the wings was the pre-war red dot center star, a marking that had been painted over and discontinued immediately after the war began. The plane looked like it had flown straight out of a meat grinder. It was a flying wreck that defied aerodynamics. The intercepting pilots pulled alongside the damaged craft, expecting to see a dead man at the stick. They peered into the cockpit. The pilot was there. He was slumped forward, his flight suit soaked in fresh, bright red blood. The canopy was shattered. Then, for a brief second, the pilot raised his head. He looked at the 2 modern planes flanking him, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and confusion. He offered a weak wave. Moments later, the P-40 stalled. It banked sharply to the left, nosedived, and plummeted toward the ground, crashing into a rice paddy in a massive explosion. When the rescue teams reached the crash site, the mystery shifted from strange to impossible. The wreckage was hot. The engine oil was fresh. The metal was twisted and smoking, but the cockpit was empty. There was no body, no blood in the seat, no parachute trails in the sky. The pilot who had just waved at them, the man covered in fresh wounds, had vanished into thin air between the stall and the impact. The only thing recovered from the cockpit was a flight diary. When intelligence officers opened it, the entries ended abruptly on December 7, 1941. The serial number of the plane was traced back to a unit stationed at Pearl Harbor. Official records confirmed that this specific aircraft had been destroyed on the ground during the Japanese attack a year prior. It had never taken off. The Ghost P-40 presents a paradox that material science cannot resolve. If the plane was destroyed in 1941, what flew in 1942? And where did the pilot go? The prevailing theory amongst the paranormal researchers and open-minded historians is that of a time slip. Imagine the pilot on that day in Pearl Harbor. He manages to get his plane airborne amidst the chaos, takes heavy fire, and is bleeding out. In his final moments, amidst the adrenaline and the violence, he flies into a localized anomaly, a storm, a cloud, a gravitational fracture. For him, the flight lasted an hour. He was just trying to find a place to land, but he exited that anomaly 365 days later. He arrived in a future where his war was already different, and perhaps the universe corrected the error. He was a man who was supposed to be dead. When the plane crashed, the timeline synchronized, and the pilot was pulled back to his original point of death in 1941, leaving only his diary and a smoking crater as proof that he had broken the barrier of time. The Battle of Los Angeles. On the night of February 24, 1942, barely 3 months after Pearl Harbor, the city of Los Angeles plunged into total darkness. Air raid sirens screamed across the county. Searchlights swept the sky. The U.S. Army's 37th Coast Artillery Brigade manned their anti-aircraft guns, convinced that a Japanese aerial invasion had begun. At 3:16 a.m., the firing started. But they weren't shooting at a fleet of Zeros. They were shooting at a single silent object that defied every known law of aviation. The object first appeared on radar roughly 120 miles west of Los Angeles. As it moved inland, thousands of civilians and military personnel looked up and saw it. It wasn't a plane. It was described as a massive, round, pale orange glow. Some witnesses likened it to a lozenge, or a giant lantern hanging in the sky. It moved with a slow, deliberate calmness, hovering directly over Culver City and Santa Monica. The military response was deafening. Over the next hour, the 37th Brigade fired over 1,400 rounds of 12.8-pound anti-aircraft shells into the sky. The concussion of the blasts shattered windows for miles. The sky turned into a wall of exploding flak. By all logic of warfare, anything made of metal should have been shredded. A squadron of bombers would have been decimated, but the object didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. Witnesses on the ground, watching through binoculars, reported seeing the shells explode directly against the hull of the craft. They described the shrapnel bouncing off the object like hail hitting a tin roof. The craft didn't speed up to escape. It simply hung there, absorbing the punishment, as if the entire might of the U.S. Army was nothing more than a nuisance. At one point, the searchlights from multiple batteries locked onto the target, creating a pyramid of light with the object trapped at the apex. This famous photograph, published in the Los Angeles Times the next day, shows the beams converging on a distinct, saucer-shaped silhouette surrounded by explosions. The chaos on the ground was real. 5 civilians died that night, 3 from heart attacks induced by the panic, and 2 from falling shrapnel. Buildings were damaged. The city was in hysteria. But up in the air, the silence was absolute. The object never returned fire. It never signaled. It simply drifted slowly south toward Long Beach and eventually disappeared over the ocean, completely unharmed. The next morning, the cover-up began. Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, held a press conference and declared the entire event a false alarm. He claimed that war nerves had caused soldiers to fire at nothing but weather balloons and shadows. But this explanation collapses under the weight of the evidence. A weather balloon does not require 400 explosive shells to bring down. A weather balloon does not move against the wind. And a weather balloon certainly does not reflect radar pulses like a solid, metallic structure. General George C. Marshall, in a memo to President Roosevelt, contradicted the Navy entirely. He wrote that as many as 15 unidentified aircraft may have been involved, moving at speeds ranging from very slow to over 200 miles per hour. Even the Japanese military after the war confirmed they had no planes in the area that night. They hadn't launched an attack. So, what was it? The Battle of Los Angeles remains the only battle in World War II where the enemy didn't fight back, because they didn't need to. The object demonstrated a technology that made armor plating obsolete. It proved that in 1942, while humanity was fighting for control of the planet, someone else was watching from above, in a machine that was immune to our most powerful weapons. The Army fired everything they had at the unknown, and the unknown simply watched, turned, and floated away. The Philadelphia Experiment. On the morning of October 28, 1943, at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, the U.S. Navy prepared to conduct a classified test that would allegedly break the laws of physics. The objective was officially listed as radar invisibility, a way to make American destroyers undetectable to Nazi U-boats. But according to witnesses aboard the nearby observation ship, the SS Andrew Furuseth, what happened next was not a test of camouflage. It was a rupture in reality. The subject of the experiment was the USS Eldridge, a Cannon-class destroyer escort equipped with massive experimental electromagnetic generators. At precisely 09 a.m., the generators were engaged. A low, vibrating hum began to emanate from the hull, so powerful that sailors on the dock felt their teeth rattle. Within seconds, the ship was enveloped in an unnatural greenish fog. This wasn't weather, it was ionization. The fog swirled violently, and then the USS Eldridge vanished. It did not just disappear from radar screens, it disappeared from sight. It disappeared from the water. There was a physical hole in the ocean where a 1,200-ton steel vessel had been sitting seconds before. For several minutes, the ship was simply gone. Then reports began to flood in from the Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Virginia, over 200 miles away. Personnel there claimed to see the ghostly outline of a destroyer materialize in their harbor for several minutes, before vanishing again. Back in Philadelphia, the green fog reappeared. The USS Eldridge solidified back into existence. But as the mist cleared and the observation teams boarded the vessel, they found a scene of absolute horror that defied medical and scientific explanation. The crew was not where they had been left. Many were violently ill, vomiting a strange white fluid. Others were catatonic, staring blankly at the sky, their minds seemingly erased. But the most terrifying discovery was found on the deck. 2 sailors were dead, but they hadn't been killed by impact or radiation. They had been fused into the ship. Their bodies were buried halfway into the solid steel of the deck, their limbs molecularly bonded with the metal. It was as if the ship and the men had occupied the same space at the same time, and when reality solidified, the laws of density failed to separate them. Another sailor was found with his hand phased through a bulkhead wall, trapped not by debris, but by the atoms of the ship itself. The Navy moved immediately to contain the situation. The survivors were placed in isolation wards and reportedly subjected to heavy sedation and hypnosis to scramble their memories. The ship's logs for that day were sealed. The entire operation, allegedly codenamed Project Rainbow, was scrubbed from official existence. The Office of Naval Research has consistently denied that the experiment took place, citing that no unified field theory exists that could bend light and matter to such a degree. However, the families of the crew told a different story. They spoke of men who would later freeze in mid-sentence, becoming stuck in time for minutes or hours. They spoke of a sailor who walked through a wall in a bar in front of witnesses and never returned. If the Philadelphia experiment was a hoax, it is the most elaborate and consistent fabrication in naval history. But if the accounts are true, then the U.S. military didn't just invent an invisibility cloak in 1943. They accidentally discovered a way to punch a hole through the fabric of space-time. The USS Eldridge didn't just travel from Philadelphia to Norfolk. It traveled outside of our physical dimension, and when it returned, it proved that the human body is not designed to withstand the friction of a universe that has lost its rules. The ship came back. The sanity of the crew did not. And the men fused to the deck remain the grisly evidence that sometimes science goes where biology cannot. Follow the Foo Fighters. In November 1944, the Allied air war over Europe had reached a fever pitch. The skies over the Rhine Valley were a chaotic grid of flak, searchlights, and desperate dogfights. But for the pilots of the U.S. 415th Night Fighter Squadron, the most terrifying enemy wasn't the Luftwaffe. It was something they couldn't shoot down, couldn't shake, and couldn't explain. They called them the Foo Fighters. The first major incident occurred on the night of November 27th. Lieutenant Ed Schluter, a seasoned pilot, was on a patrol mission near Strasbourg. Visibility was excellent. Suddenly, his radar observer, Lieutenant Donald Myers, shouted over the intercom. He had spotted lights. Schluter looked out the cockpit window, expecting to see the exhaust trails of a German jet or the tracers of anti-aircraft fire. Instead, he saw 8 to 10 glowing red balls of light, hovering in a loose formation off his port wing. They weren't aircraft. They had no fuselage, no wings, and no propellers. They were simply spheres of intense, pulsating incandescence. Schluter immediately banked the plane into a hard dive to evade them, assuming they were a new type of German guided missile. The lights didn't just follow, they mirrored his movement perfectly. When he accelerated to 200 miles per hour, the orbs accelerated. When he slowed down, they slowed down. They moved with an impossible, frictionless agility, gluing themselves to his wingtips as if tethered by invisible strings. Then, just as the crew prepared to open fire, the lights vanished, not by flying away but by simply blinking out of existence like a switched-off lamp. When Schluter returned to base, he expected to be ridiculed. Instead, he found the intelligence officers grim-faced. His report wasn't unique. Across the European theater, and even in the Pacific, pilots were reporting the same phenomenon. Some described them as Christmas tree ornaments that danced around their bombers. Others saw massive, singular balls of silver fire that would fly right through their formations without causing a collision. The behavior was always the same: intelligence. These weren't random atmospheric phenomena like St. Elmo's fire, which clings to holes, or ball lightning, which is explosive and erratic. These objects tracked targets. They anticipated maneuvers. They played cat-and-mouse games with the most advanced aircraft on Earth. The Allied High Command was terrified. They assumed the Germans had developed a radical new weapon, perhaps a radio-controlled probe designed to interfere with radar or ignition systems. They feared the Foo Fighters, a name borrowed from the surrealist comic strip Smokey Stover, were the prelude to a massive technological strike. But the mystery deepened after the war ended. When Allied intelligence interrogated the captured Luftwaffe pilots and Nazi scientists, asking about the fireballs, the Germans looked at them with genuine confusion. They hadn't built them. In fact, the German pilots had filed their own reports. They claimed they were being stalked by American secret weapons, glowing death spheres that tracked their Messerschmitts over the Rhineland. Both sides of the greatest war in history were being watched by a third party. The Foo Fighters represent a massive breach in the narrative of World War II. We define the war as Axis versus Allies. But for months, the sky was occupied by a technology that made both sides look primitive. These objects defied gravity, accelerated instantly, and possessed a glowing energy source that no 1940s battery could produce. Crucially, they never attacked. They never fired a shot. They simply observed the carnage. Were they extraterrestrial drones monitoring our nuclear development? Were they a terrestrial plasma phenomenon that woke up due to the intense electromagnetic saturation of the radar war? We still don't know. The war ended, the flak stopped, and the Foo Fighters largely disappeared, leaving behind thousands of terrified witnesses and a single chilling conclusion. The humans were fighting for the ground, but someone else already owned the sky. The Vanishing Regiment of Nanking. In the annals of military history, soldiers often disappear. They are lost in the fog of war, buried in unmarked graves, or captured without record. But in December 1939, during the Second Sino-Japanese War, an entire army did not just get lost. They ceased to exist. The incident occurred just outside the city of Nanking, now Nanjing. Colonel Li Fuxian of the Chinese army was tasked with a crucial defensive maneuver, holding a strategic line in the rolling hills roughly 2 miles south of the city to prevent a Japanese advance. His force consisted of 2,688 soldiers, a regiment of hardened, experienced troops who were well equipped and dug in for a heavy fight. On the evening of December 9th, Colonel Li inspected the lines personally. He found the men at their posts, morale steady and defenses fortified. He returned to his headquarters a mile behind the front line to wait for the morning assault. The night was quiet. There were no reports of gunfire, no radio distress calls, no explosions. The heavy artillery from the Japanese side had ceased for the night. But when Colonel Li was awoken the next morning by his aide, the report he received made no sense. The aide claimed the defense line was silent, not quiet in the military sense, but completely dead. Colonel Li drove to the front immediately. What he found remains one of the most chilling anomalies of the 20th century. The trenches were empty. But they weren't just abandoned in a panic. The scene suggested a sudden, instantaneous interruption of life. Heavy machine guns were still mounted on their tripods, loaded and ready to fire. Field fires were still smoldering, some with pots of rice that had burned dry over the heat, suggesting the men had been there one moment and gone the next. Personal equipment, canteens, helmets, and backpacks was left neatly in place. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood spatter, no bodies, no drag. Marks indicating the wounded had been moved. Nearly 3,000 men had vanished from the face of the earth in a span of 6 hours. The immediate theory was mass desertion. Colonel Li was furious. But as the investigation unfolded, the desertion theory fell apart. The geography of the area made a silent mass exit impossible. To the north was the advancing Japanese army. Surrendering to them would have been a loud, chaotic process, and the Japanese, who kept meticulous records of prisoners, had no record of capturing a regiment that night. To the east and west were steep, rugged hills that were impassable for a group that size moving quickly. The only viable exit was a single bridge leading back to the Chinese lines, the Wan-Q Bridge. Here is the glitch in the timeline. Colonel Li had stationed 2 heavy sentry units at that bridge all night to ensure no enemy spies crossed over. When interrogated, the sentries swore on their lives that not a single soldier had crossed the bridge. They had stood watch from dusk until dawn. They had seen no one leave. They had heard no commotion. If the regiment didn't cross the bridge, didn't go into the hills, and didn't surrender to the Japanese, where did they go? After the war, investigators combed through the Japanese archives. They found detailed logs of every skirmish and capture in the Nanking sector for December 1939. There was absolutely no mention of encountering a force of 3,000 men in that area. The regiment hadn't been killed, they hadn't been captured, they hadn't run away. It was as if a hole had opened in the landscape and swallowed the battalion whole. Some theorists have linked this event to Hollow Earth folklore, speculating that the limestone caves in the Nanking Hills hide entrances to subterranean caverns. Others suggest a massive localized time slip similar to the time tunnel reports from Burma. But the physical evidence leaves us with a terrifying reality. Nearly 3,000 human beings, armed and alert, were erased from history in the total silence. They left their dinner cooking on the fire, but they took their bodies with them into the void. The L-8 Ghost Blimp. On a foggy Sunday morning, August 16, 1942, a U.S. Navy blimp marked L-8 lifted off from Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay. Its mission was routine, an anti-submarine patrol along the coast to watch for Japanese subs lurking near the Golden Gate Bridge. On board were two experienced officers, Lieutenant Ernest Cody and Ensign Charles Adams. They radioed in their position at 7:42 a.m., reporting an oil slick near the Farallon Islands. It was a standard check-in. It was also the last time anyone would ever hear from them. Hours later, the blimp reappeared, but it was behaving strangely. It wasn't patrolling, it was drifting. The massive airship floated aimlessly inland, bouncing off roofs in Daly City, before finally crashing softly onto a suburban street. Neighbors and local police rushed to the scene to rescue the crew. The gondola was intact, the door was open. But when they looked inside, they found the eerie silence of a Mary Celeste in the sky. The cabin was empty. This wasn't a violent crash. It was a soft landing piloted by the wind. Investigators assumed the men had bailed out over the ocean, perhaps due to a fire or engine failure. But as they examined the gondola, the mechanical failure theory fell apart and was replaced by an impossible mystery. Everything on board was in perfect working order. The engines were fine. The radio was fully functional. The fuel tanks were plenty full. Crucially, the emergency gear was untouched. 2 parachutes were still strapped to the wall. The life raft was still stowed in its compartment. If the men had fallen out or jumped, they had done so without their safety gear. But the most chilling detail was the classified briefcase. Inside the cabin sat a weighted briefcase containing top-secret codebooks and orders. Navy protocol was absolute. In any emergency, the first thing an officer must do is destroy that briefcase or throw it into the ocean to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. The briefcase was sitting right behind the pilot's seat, untouched. This implies that whatever happened to Cody and Adams didn't happen during a panic. They didn't declare an emergency. They didn't radio for help. They didn't grab the codes. They simply vanished. Witnesses on the ground added to the confusion. Several fishing boats and commercial pilots saw the blimp earlier in the day. They reported seeing it descend close to the water to investigate the oil slick and then rise back up. None of them saw anyone fall. None saw a struggle. One witness claimed to see the door of the gondola latched open, a mechanism that required deliberate human action to engage. Why would 2 experienced airmen latch the door open at 2,000 feet? The Navy conducted a massive sea and air search. They scoured the ocean for weeks. No bodies were ever found. No uniforms washed up. The official inquiry concluded with the word unknown. The L-8 became known as the Ghost Blimp. It was repaired and put back into service, but the mystery remained. Did the crew encounter something in that oil slick that made them abandon ship without their parachutes? Did they experience a shared delirium? Or did they encounter an aerial anomaly, like the Foo Fighters reported by other pilots, that removed them from the cabin without disturbing the ship? The L-8 returned home safely. Its crew simply ceased to exist between the waves and the clouds. The time tunnel of Burma. The Burma campaign was known as the Green Hell. It was a brutal, chaotic war fought in dense jungles, where the enemy was often invisible until they were 5 feet away. But in November 1944, a British reconnaissance patrol deep in the Arakan Mountains encountered an enemy that wasn't Japanese, wasn't human, and wasn't terrestrial. The incident involved a specialized section of Chindits, the famous long-range penetration groups trained to operate deep behind enemy lines. This particular unit, consisting of 22 men, was tasked with securing a ridge designated Hill 309. The geography was critical. It overlooked a Japanese supply route. The patrol radioed in at 080 hours, reporting that the sector was quiet, the weather was clear, the sky was blue, and visibility was perfect. But 20 minutes later, the rear guard, a separate unit stationed about 400 meters down the slope, watched a phenomenon that defied meteorology. They reported seeing a single, massive cloud descend from the sky. It didn't drift like mist. It settled with the weight of a solid object. Witnesses described it as opaque, metallic gray, and incredibly dense. It didn't conform to the wind or the terrain. It simply sat directly on top of Hill 309, swallowing the entire summit in a perfect geometric block of whiteout conditions. The rear guard attempted to radio the forward unit. All they got was static. Not the crackle of interference, but a dead air silence that suggested the signal was being blocked by a lead wall. Then, the cloud began to behave aggressively. It didn't disperse. It lifted. According to the field reports, the cloud rose vertically into the sky, maintaining its dense shape until it vanished into the upper atmosphere. When the rear guard advanced to the summit to regroup with their comrades, they stopped dead in their tracks. Hill 309 was empty. There were no bodies, there were no signs of a firefight, no shell casings, no blood trails, no blast marks. But the soldiers hadn't just run away. The evidence left behind made the situation physically impossible. Their heavy equipment was still there. Rifles were found leaning against trees. Backpacks were sitting on the ground, as if the men had just taken a break. A pot of tea was reportedly found still warm on a field stove. Soldiers do not abandon their weapons in the jungle. In 1944, Burma, dropping your rifle was a death sentence. For 22 hardened Chindits to leave their guns and gear behind, neatly placed, not scattered in panic, suggests they didn't flee. They were taken. The Japanese later captured the hill, but post-war interrogations revealed that they had never engaged the unit. In fact, Japanese scouts in the area had also seen the Gray Wall and were so terrified by it that they refused to advance until it was gone. So, where did the men go? Aerial reconnaissance of the surrounding jungle showed no movement. No tracks led away from the summit. The mud, which would have preserved the footprints of 22 running men, was undisturbed. The only tracks ended at the perimeter of where the cloud had sat. Inside that perimeter, nothing. The incident was logged, but the files were buried under the chaos of the retreat. However, rumors persisted among the local tribes of the Arakan. They spoke of the Sky Eaters, spirits that would descend in mist and take hunters who wandered too high. Military theorists have since called this the time tunnel theory. They speculate that the localized weather anomaly wasn't weather at all, but a transient portal, or a gravitational anomaly that temporarily overlapped with the hill. The men didn't die. They walked into a different place, or perhaps a different time. They stepped into the fog of war and simply never stepped out. The rifles they left behind remain the only proof that they were ever there at all. Silent monuments to a platoon that was erased by the sky. The dead gliders of D-Day. The invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, was the largest amphibious assault in history. The sky was filled with thousands of aircraft, including vast fleets of Horsa gliders. Silent, wooden aircraft towed behind bombers and released to glide stealthily behind enemy lines. They were known as flying coffins because of their fragile plywood construction. But for one specific glider discovered in the hedgerows of Sainte-Mère-Église, the nickname was literal in a way that defies biological reality. The incident occurred on June 9th, 3 days after the initial invasion. A patrol of the U.S. 82nd Airborne was securing a sector of farmland when they heard the distinctive whoosh of a glider coming in for a landing. It wasn't crashing, it was a controlled descent. The soldiers watched as the massive wooden craft flared perfectly, skidded across the muddy field, and came to a precise halt near a tree line. The landing was textbook. The soldiers rushed forward, weapons drawn, expecting to greet a reinforcement squad of British or American troops. But the glider didn't open. There was no movement inside, no cheering, no sound of boots kicking open the cargo door, just silence. Thinking the crew might be wounded, the sergeant ordered his men to pry the door open. When they finally cracked the seal, a smell hit them that made battle-hardened veterans vomit. It wasn't the smell of fuel or cordite. It was the smell of advanced decay. Inside the cockpit, the pilot and co-pilot were strapped into their seats. They were dead. but they hadn't been shot. There were no bullet holes in the canopy, no flak damage to the fuselage. The medical officer who arrived on the scene minutes later noted a terrifying anomaly: rigor mortis. The bodies were stiff, cold, and showing signs of decomposition, consistent with men who had been dead for at least 48 hours. Yet, the patrol had just watched the glider land 5 minutes ago. The flight log found in the cockpit deepened the impossible nature of the event. It indicated that the glider had taken off from a base in southern England that very morning, part of a supply wave. The flight time should have been less than 2 hours. If the log was correct, the men should have been alive and warm. If the medical evidence was correct, the men had died 2 days before they took off. So, who flew the plane? A glider requires constant physical strength to fly. There is no autopilot. You have to fight the crosswinds, adjust the flaps, and flare just before impact to prevent a nosedive. A corpse cannot do this. A man in rigor mortis cannot move the stick. Yet, the soldiers on the ground swore the landing was active. They saw the ailerons move. They saw the nose pull up. The glider was stripped of its cargo, ammunition and medical supplies, which were curiously untouched, and the bodies were buried quickly in a mass grave. The incident was scrubbed from the unit's official history, filed under landing, accidents. But rumors persisted throughout the European theater of similar events, the ghost flights. Some theorists suggest that the sheer volume of energy and violence during D-Day created stress fractures in time, localized temporal distortions. Did this glider fly into a time pocket where time moved faster for the occupants than for the outside world? Did they spend weeks trapped in a cloud bank that only lasted minutes for the observers on the ground, starving to death while frozen in the air? Or is there a more disturbing possibility? That under the extreme stress of war, the human spirit, or something else, can force a dead body to complete its mission. The glider at Sainte-Mère-Église remains one of the darkest anomalies of the war, a wooden box that landed perfectly, piloted by dead men, delivering supplies from a timeline that no longer matched our own. The Angel of the Steppe. The Eastern Front was the bloodiest theater of World War II. It was a place where miracles didn't happen, only attrition. But in July 1943, during the catastrophic Battle of Kursk, the largest tank engagement in history, a Soviet rifle battalion reported an event that saved them from annihilation, an event that Soviet censors tried to erase for 50 years. The unit, the 144th Rifle Division, was dug in near the edge of the Prochorovka field. They were low on ammunition, cut off from their supply lines, and facing the advance of a massive German panzer division. The soldiers knew they were dead men walking. The ground shook as the heavy Tiger tanks crested the horizon, their 88mm cannons leveling the trench line. At 05:30 a.m., just as the German assault began, the sky changed. According to the diaries of 3 separate soldiers and a report filed by a political commissar, a white fire descended from the clouds. It wasn't a flare. It wasn't an airstrike. It was a pillar of light that formed a distinct humanoid shape. It hovered directly between the Soviet trenches and the advancing German tanks. What happened next defies the mechanics of war. The German tanks, which were less than 800 meters away and closing fast, suddenly stopped. The roar of their engines, the deafening diesel growl that terrified infantry, went silent. The tanks didn't break. They stalled simultaneously. Dozens of reliable German machines, renowned for their engineering, died at the exact same second. The Angel, as the Russians later called it, expanded. The light became so intense that soldiers on both sides threw their hands over their eyes to avoid being blinded. Within this blinding radiance, the Soviet troops reported feeling a physical wave of heat, but it didn't burn. It felt like a sudden, pressurized silence. The fear that had paralyzed them vanished, replaced by an unnatural calm. Then the light ascended. It shot vertically into the atmosphere, leaving a trail of ionized air that hung like a scar in the blue sky. When the German crews tried to restart their tanks, the engines wouldn't turn over. Their electrical systems had been fried. The formidable Panzer Division sat helpless on the steppe, immobile targets. The Soviet counterattack was brutal. They swarmed the disabled tanks and pushed the German line back 3 kilometers. The Angel had turned a massacre into a victory. But the Soviet Union was an atheist state. There was no room for angels in the Red Army. When the report reached the NKVD, the secret police, the response was not celebration, it was suppression. The political commissar who filed the report was arrested for spreading religious superstition and defeatist hallucination. He was sent to a gulag. The soldiers were ordered, under threat of execution, to never speak of the white fire. The official battle record stated simply that the German advance was halted due to mechanical failure and superior Soviet anti-tank tactics. But mechanical failure doesn't strike 50 tanks at once, and tactics don't descend from the clouds. Decades later, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the suppressed files surfaced. They revealed that German POWs captured that day had also spoken of the light. They didn't call it an angel. They described it as a weapon of blinding energy. They believed the Russians had developed a new type of EMP, electromagnetic pulse, device. But in 1943, EMP technology didn't exist. Was it a mass hallucination triggered by the stress of imminent death? Or did something intervene on the steppe that day? The Angel of the Steppe remains a singular anomaly in a war defined by industrial slaughter. For 5 minutes, the guns stopped, the engines died, and the sky intervened. It suggests that even in the middle of hell, there are forces watching that can simply turn the war off. The Nazi Bell. The Nazi Bell, Die Glocke. In the final desperate months of World War II, deep within a secret facility near the Czech border known as the Giant, Der Riese, Nazi scientists were conducting an experiment so dangerous that it ended up killing the very men who built it. The project was classified under the highest possible security clearance, known as Kriegsentscheidend, decisive for the war. But this wasn't a bomb. It wasn't a jet engine. It was a device designed to manipulate the fabric of gravity and time itself. The device was codenamed Die Glocke, or the Bell. According to recovered SS documents and the testimony of Polish intelligence officer Igor Witkowski, the machine was a heavy metal object, roughly 9 feet wide and 12 feet high, shaped like a large church bell. Inside, it contained 2 massive lead-lined cylinders that spun in opposite directions at incredibly high speeds. These cylinders were filled with a mysterious violet-colored liquid metal, codenamed Cerium 525. When the machine was activated, it required so much electricity that the lights in the surrounding towns would dim. But the sound it made was not mechanical. It was described as a buzzing swarm of bees, a sound that seemed to penetrate the human skull. The effects of the bell were terrifyingly anomalous. During the initial test runs, the scientists observed phenomena that defied all biological logic. Any organic matter placed within 200 meters of the bell didn't just burn, it dissolved. Plants would decompose into a black, grease-like substance within minutes. But they didn't rot. It was as if their timeline had been accelerated by decades in a matter of seconds. More disturbing were the effects on living subjects. Crystals began to form in the blood of animals left near the test rig. The liquid Cerium 525 seemed to emit a field of radiation that was not nuclear, but something else entirely. A field that disrupted the molecular cohesion of life. 5 of the original 7 scientists working on the project died during these tests. They didn't die from radiation poisoning. They died because their internal organs simply ceased to function, disintegrating from the inside out. But the bell's true purpose was not biological warfare, it was propulsion. The structure where the tests took place, known as the henge, still stands today. It is a massive concrete ring reinforced with heavy steel hooks. Observers claimed that when the cylinders reached maximum velocity, the bell would glow with a pale blue light and lift off the ground, straining against the chains holding it down. But it wasn't just defying gravity, it was distorting the space around it. Witnesses described seeing a mirror-like distortion above the bell, where the reflection of the room looked warped and elongated. Some researchers believe the Nazis were attempting to create a torsion field, a ripple in space-time that would allow for faster-than-light travel, or theoretically, the manipulation of time. This explains the extreme secrecy. If the Nazis had unlocked anti-gravity or time dilation, the war would have been irrelevant. They would have controlled reality. But just as the Red Army began to close in on the facility in 1945, the project vanished. SS General Hans Kammler, the man in charge of Hitler's secret weapons, reportedly ordered the execution of the remaining 60 scientists who knew how the bell worked. Their bodies were buried in a mass grave, hidden forever. As for the bell itself, it was gone. When Allied forces arrived, they found only the empty concrete hinge and severed power cables. Kamler and the bell had disappeared. Did they fly it out to South America? Did the U.S. military capture it and hide it in the Nevada desert? Or is there a darker possibility? Given the bell's ability to warp space and dissolve biological matter, some physicists suggest that the device didn't just fly away. It may have moved through something. The Nazi bell remains the only weapon in history that killed its creators, defied gravity, and then vanished without a physical trace. It suggests that, in their hunt for power, the Nazis opened a door they couldn't close, and perhaps they didn't escape through it, but were pulled into it. The bell is likely not lost in a warehouse. It is lost in time. The Gremlins. To modern ears, the word gremlin sounds like a cartoon or a myth. But for the pilots of the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Forces in World War II, gremlins were not folklore. They were a documented physical threat that caused more mechanical failures than enemy fire. The phenomenon began in 1940 during the Battle of Britain. Pilots returning from sorties would report bizarre mechanical anomalies that defied physics. Cables that had been inspected an hour prior were found snapped, not frayed by wear, but cut clean through as if by shears. Glass canopies would shatter outward against the pressure of the wind, as if struck from the inside. Engines would cough and die over the channel, only to restart perfectly once the plane dropped below 1,000 feet, with mechanics finding absolutely nothing wrong with the fuel lines upon inspection. At first, command dismissed it as combat fatigue, but the reports were too consistent and too specific. Pilots didn't just report damage. They reported entities. Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator who flew combat missions in the Pacific, admitted in his journals to sensing presences in the cockpit that would aid or hinder the flight. Other pilots were more blunt. They described seeing small, shadow-like figures crawling out on the wings during high-altitude flights. In one famous report from a B-17 bomber crew over Germany, the tail gunner screamed over the intercom that a creature was hammering on the starboard elevator. The crew assumed he was hallucinating from hypoxia, but when the plane landed, the starboard elevator was hanging by a single hinge. The metal was dented and torn, not by flak, which leaves shrapnel marks, but by blunt force trauma, as if hit repeatedly with a sledgehammer, at 25,000 feet, at 300 miles per hour. The anomaly crossed enemy lines. The Germans had their own name for it, Klabautermann. They blamed these invisible saboteurs for the inexplicable failure of their advanced Me-262 jet engines, which would often flame out for no mechanical reason. The Ministry of Defense in Britain actually took the threat seriously enough to have intelligence officers investigate whether the Germans had developed a weapon that used high-frequency sound waves to snap cables or induce hallucinations. They found nothing. So, what were the Gremlins? Skeptics say it was a psychological projection of stress, a way for pilots to externalize the fear of mechanical failure. But psychology doesn't cut brake lines. Psychology doesn't leave teeth marks on reinforced steel cables, which were reportedly found on several P-51 Mustangs. The Gremlin phenomenon suggests that the intense emotional and kinetic energy of the war may have attracted or manifested something parasitic. These weren't cute mischief makers. They were invisible saboteurs that thrived on the edge of death, dismantling our machines in the only place where we were most vulnerable, the sky. Of all the anomalies in World War II, this one is the most disturbing because it suggests that we weren't just fighting the Axis. We were fighting something that lived in the clouds, something that hated our machines, and something that, unlike the Nazis, was never defeated. 11 anomalies, 11 ruptures in the timeline. From the ship that teleported in Philadelphia to the regiment that vanished in Nanking, the evidence is overwhelming. World War II was not just a conflict of armies. It was a collision of realities. The massive release of energy, kinetic, nuclear, and emotional, may have cracked the thin veneer of physics that holds our world together. We are told that science explains everything, but these cases prove that when the world is on fire, science is the first thing to burn. The history books tell us who won the war, but they will never tell us what we lost in the fog. I'm the Shortcut Detective. Subscribe and turn on the bell. The investigation into the impossible has just begun.